Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I think we'll have a few more people trickling in as we go. But welcome to the May event of our Scholars Library series. I think a lot of you have been here before, but each month this initiative allows a scholar to come and talk about their literary works to those within the Rhodes community and those from outside of it as well. And it's really nice to see you here. Thanks for taking the time. I'm really excited today to welcome Nina, who's going to talk about her book, How the Colour Line Bends. And fellow scholar Nicole is here to moderate the conversation. She's currently studying her MSc in Evidence-Based Social Intervention and Policy Evaluation, and will begin her DPhil in Translational Health Sciences this autumn. She spends her free time playing squash and guitar, and apparently will never lose a game of Uno. So you might want to challenge her to that at some point. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Nicole, who's going to give you a further introduction to Nina and the session, and we can get into it. Have a think and post any questions you might have in the chat as we go along, and we can put them in the Q&A section. And I'll also post the link to Nina's book in the chat as well for anyone who doesn't have a copy yet. You should get one. But over to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Georgie, and thank you for everyone for coming here today to sit with us for this discussion about the book. So just to reiterate some points made below, if you do have any questions throughout the session, please feel free to send either Georgie, Nina, and I, preferably a message, and we can hope to get to the end where we'll have some room for some Q&As. But just to begin with the introduction, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Nina Yancy. So she is a consultant, writer, and Rhodes Scholar based in Brooklyn, New York. Her recent book, How the Colour Line Bends, is based on her DPhil in politics, which she completed during the Rhodes Scholarship here at Oxford. She currently works for McKinsey & Company, where she serves clients across the federal, state, and local government with a focus on workforce and economic development and promoting racial equity. A brief overview about how the color line bends. We'll be discussing how in 2019, a group of Louisianans voted to create a new city in part of the Baton Rouge area. The effort drew attention because the decision would create a disproportionately white and wealthy city while leaving the considerably poorer and majority Black school district behind. In How the Color Line Bends, Nina explores and shows what white people think depends on where they live, because they are more likely to feel threatened where race is salient. She illustrates how the color line remains relevant if we appreciate the ability of that line to harden or soften, but not necessarily break. So help me, everyone, to welcome Nina Yancy.
Thanks, Nicole. Thank you. Thank you for the virtual claps. It's so good to see all of you. Thanks for taking time out of your day. And it's particularly exciting to see some familiar faces. So looking forward to the conversation.
So just to begin briefly, tell us a bit about the title of the book and why you chose the title. And for someone who may not be really familiar with the color line, what do you mean for it to bend? You do make some commentary in the book about the notion of both the material and metaphorical lines. So if you could just maybe explore that a bit before we dive in a bit deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. So the color line is a really old idea in US racial politics. It means what you probably can guess, which is this idea of a divide between Black and white Americans in particular. The concept can travel to other racial groups and other contexts, but it has deep roots in Black American political thought. Many of you probably know the line from W.E.B. Du Bois, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So that's the line we're talking about. But Nicole, as you noted, I intentionally define the color line in my book as both a metaphor and a literal thing. And so this definition comes from sociologist Mary Patillo, who argues that, we're talking about, metaphorically speaking, a line that manifests in mechanisms and practices in things like attitudes or bias or prejudice, those sorts of mechanisms that maintain racial inequality. But we're also talking more literally about places and systems, about material, tangible outcomes where Black folks are on one side and white folks are on another side of either a visible or an invisible line, right? Inequality as it shows up in our neighborhoods, in economic outcomes, et cetera. And I think it's important to understand the color line as both a metaphor and a literal thing, because my book specifically looks at the relationship between those two versions of the line. So I'm particularly interested in how geography influences US racial politics. So how where people live and experience the literal material color line, how that relates to what they think on issues related to race. So the expression of the metaphorical color line. And then when I'm saying the color line bends, the core question underneath a lot of racial politics scholarship is, well, why is the color line still a problem? Why does it seem to be the problem of the 21st century as well? And I'm very much invested in that broader project. But the thing is that many times what that investigation looks like is asking, why do we still see so many racist white Americans and so many poor Black Americans? I'm obviously using reductive language and scare quotes, but the point is that we often only see a default kind of assumption of those really egregious manifestations of the problem. And I, as a middle-class Black person who spends a lot of time with racially progressive white people, was interested in how the color line could persist despite those seeming signs of progress, right? Why is it still a problem despite that? And the idea of a flexible color line allows me to think about, okay, how does this line ebb and flow in different places? I look at a number of topics, the case study you mentioned. I also look at attitudes on affirmative action, on welfare spending, so poverty assistance in the US. And I show how the expression of white attitudes about these issues varies according to different geographic contexts that they inhabit. But I also show how the line is resilient, right? If something's flexible, it can bend but not break. And I argue that flexibility, that resilience, that ability for it to bend is rooted in what I call a shared white perspective, the way that whiteness influences white Americans' views of and interactions with racial politics, even across the spectrum of white racial attitudes, even when we're talking about the Black middle class as opposed to lower income Black communities. And so we'll talk a lot more about this, but that's just an overview of what the color line is, how it does have these different manifestations, literally, metaphorically, and my interest in how it does ebb and flow while still maintaining its strength.
One of my favorite quotes actually from the book is when you were discussing this earlier, and you mentioned that the importance of naming the color line's flexibility is to identify where it's likely to harden, but to keep us vigilant when it seems to be receding, to contemplate the potential of helping the line bend towards inclusion and maybe one day break. And I feel like that really captures the notion that when something is flexible, it does mean that it can adapt. And I think that notion and contemplation with this flexibility should keep us on guard in terms of how we can better navigate our efforts to address it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think we often see this kind of conflation of the idea of, racial progress being a reduction in racial inequality and also a, improvement in race relations or how white people think about Black people. And, I would suggest those are actually really different things. And we could see improvements in, reducing the racial wealth gap that could actually lead to a flare. Some of the backlash that I think we've seen recently in terms of how white Americans might feel if that is, a sign of someone encroaching on their privileged position. And so I think the word vigilance is an important one there in terms of kind of staying attuned to these dynamics and, obviously pushing for progress and not trying to be pessimistic, but recognizing the slippery way prejudice can continue to rear its head.
So you discussed the notion particularly of place in shaping these perspectives and attitudes. In the first half of the book, you discussed the case of St. George. Could you tell us a bit more about this effort and why it drew the criticisms that it drew, as well as some of the common responses to those criticisms?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you noted in your intro, I look at this case in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Baton Rouge is the capital of Louisiana. It is less popular than its illustrious neighbor, New Orleans. But it is very much more a classic Southern American city in that it's, pretty evenly divided Black and white, and it doesn't have, kind of the cultural allure of New Orleans. But, it's a place that's really known for, its love of its football team, its love of family. It's a very religious community. And so I went there because of this ongoing issue where part of the Baton Rouge area has been for over 10 years trying to effectively secede and form its own new city. And the express purpose of the organizers was to create a new school district and break away from the existing Baton Rouge public schools. And this drew criticism for a few reasons, both in terms of its present impact and the history of Baton Rouge. So present impact, first of all, it would be a large area. It would be about 90,000 people, which would make it the 6th largest city in Louisiana, which is a small state. It's also only about 12% Black in a county that, as I mentioned, is about half Black, half white. And average incomes are about $30,000 a year higher than the rest of the county. So it is a notably white and wealthy area, and it would leave even more disproportionately poor and Black school district behind. So already it rose some red flags in terms of the racialized impact. But then the historical reason why it also has drawn criticism is because it is a direct descendant of one of the longest running federal desegregation lawsuits in the US. So from 1956 to 2003, with some oversight lasting until 2007, Baton Rouge was under a federal desegregation order, which meant that they had effectively ignored the ruling, the famous ruling in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, that led to integration in schools in the US. They essentially ignored it for a couple decades. And then it wasn't until the 80s that they made any progress towards really integrating schools. And in the 80s, a federal judge implemented a strict busing order. And busing was common across the US at this time, but the idea is that you send children by school bus to schools other than the ones they would have attended in their neighborhood in order to achieve a better racial balance across a larger area. So, kids travel by bus. Busing is the short reference to this practice. And so in the 80s, this judge implements this policy. It was not popular in many places in the US. It was certainly not popular in Baton Rouge, and it sparked a huge amount of white flight from the school systems. So whereas Baton Rouge schools were about 60% white before the order, by the early 2000s, they were only about 11% white. They also became disproportionately poorer. And in the process, private schools explode, Catholic schools in particular in the area explode, and some white families are just leaving the area altogether. So we see this huge shift in the makeup of Baton Rouge schools, all the while the federal government is still, in charge, has to approve changes. They're eventually released from the lawsuit in the early 2000s, more because there were so few white students to spread around the parish anymore. And as soon as the lawsuit is lifted, 3 parts of the Baton Rouge area immediately, or in quick succession, break away and form their own school districts. And St. George, which is this area that I was studying, wanted to call the city of St. George, it draws direct inspiration from these examples. So not only does it have this racialized impact in the present day, it follows from, this pretty fraught history that directly inspired them to leave. And they would, tell you all the ways that, they weren't racially motivated. I could tell you more about the specifics of how they were technically outside of city lines, so they're not really seceding. They would just be leaving the school district, et cetera. But regardless, they were really invested in that defense, which shows that race was just an explicit part of the conversation, right? They were on edge to defend why they weren't being racist or racially motivated. And, across the country, attention was drawn to this case because of that racialized impact today and both that history of fights over desegregation.
With your particular choice to choose Baton Rouge, you also mentioned in the book that there was other additional factors that you hadn't intended, particularly the death and the murder of Alton Sterling at that time that impacted that case study. So can you discuss a bit why you chose that case study and what it meant to be there at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Louisiana was an easy place for me to be looking for case studies because it's where both sides of my family are from. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers there. My dad grew up in this segregated school system I just referenced. So it's a place that I had family ties to. When I learned about this St. George effort, you can probably see how it was, connected to some of the interests I shared in terms of geography and politics, this issue where we see race and place really intertwined as people are fighting over where the boundaries of a city should be, where the boundaries of a school district should be, et cetera. So I come across this St. George issue and I realized it would be a really good fit. I then arrive in Baton Rouge in the summer of 2016, and totally by chance, I arrive a few days after Alton Sterling, a Black man, is murdered by police at point blank range. And then a few days after I arrive, there is this really surprising retaliatory attack by a Black man who kills several local law enforcement officers. So over a little more than a week, there are these two, very high profile racialized killings, and it is what is fundamentally a pretty small metropolitan area. And that was totally unplanned. I had no idea that was going to happen. And it was obviously an incredibly tragic time and a really upsetting time for the area. It was also surprisingly a theoretically powerful thing to happen, theoretically in terms of for the theories that I was exploring and developing, because while I was already there to talk with people about the case of St. George, it just meant that, which as I noted, had been a debate that had already been infused with issues related to race. Then these shootings happen that just make race even more at the forefront of people's minds. And so it meant that I, in conversation with respondents, wouldn't even have to bring up anything related to race, right? They would want to process and explain and think about what had happened. And so again, it's a terrible thing to have happened, but also interestingly really brought out a lot of deeper reflections and additional reflections that I might not have had a chance to study otherwise. And so I was grateful that, such a terrible thing could at least be part of what could reveal more insight in my research.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I absolutely love the book, but I would love if you could read a bit of a portion of it so others can experience just a part of it, and then I think it's preferably from chapter 3, if you don't mind.
Yes. No, totally. Yes, we chat about this, and I think it is helpful to hear my interviewees in their own words at times. So yes, I'll just read a bit with the group from the opening of chapter 3, which is when I really share the conversations that I had with all of these folks in Baton Rouge. I spoke to 48 residents of the area, and so I think this will give you a taste for what it was like, and also kind of set the scene and introduce some of the findings. So. Allow me to read to you from chapter 3. I was surprised not to have gotten a flat out rejection sooner. The voice said, "Now listen here, I've been around a long time." I grimaced with the phone held to my ear. I hadn't been told to listen here since I was a teenager. The term does not usually preface good news. He continued. Why would someone come all the way from Oxford to ask about St. George if not to try to expose it as some sort of a racist effort? This chilly response came from a St. George supporter and colorful persona named Randy. His reply exposed how central race had become to the conversation around St. George. Supporters were actively on the defense to demonstrate it was not racially motivated. It's a testament to how small a mid-sized city can feel that less than a week later, I found myself squeezed into a 12-year-old sized desk next to none other than Randy himself. We were both attending a school board event at a local middle school. He had arrived shortly after the meeting started, and the only open seat was right next to me. He, of course, had no idea that I was the person who had come all the way from Oxford, where I was a graduate student at the time. Both of us blended into the mix of attendees at the meeting. It was older white graduates and younger Black graduates of the same nearby high school, whose racial demographics had flipped drastically in the mid-1980s, during that busing period that I mentioned, but for which the group was organizing a multi-decade alumni event. Randy's persona in this setting was opposite from what I'd experienced in our phone call. He was congenial and inclusive. He emerged as a natural leader in this biracial group, and he clearly was respected by the others for his commitment to the school. I introduced myself to him once the meeting ended. Having spent the last hour sharing a copy of both the meeting agenda and the LSU and Southern University football schedules, lest the group accidentally schedule a future event that conflicted with a football game, Randy was probably more inclined to believe that I had some legitimate interest in the Baton Rouge community than he had been on the phone. Afterward, we ended up sitting down to talk for an hour and a half. Though he was an outspoken supporter of St. George, he not only lives outside of the boundaries of the proposed new city, but he's one of few white holdouts in North Baton Rouge. He still lives in the historically white blue-collar neighborhood where he grew up, and he's exchanged its changing demographics to now a majority Black inner city area firsthand. He slightly overestimated the Black majority within the city lines, but he maintained, black-white doesn't play into it, to me, very much. My encounter with Deborah got off to a very different start. In response to my first question, which was simply to tell me about the area, she took a deep breath. Let me just tell you my background because I don't want to throw your data off. Deborah is a social worker and explained to me a lot of social workers literally choose the nice area by zip code, but explained that she would work anywhere in the parish where her services were needed. I've been in lots of parts of Baton Rouge Parish that most middle-income people have never been. Underneath her words were racialized meanings, nice and middle income being code for predominantly white areas and a predominantly white income bracket. But what she was trying to communicate to me was clear. Unlike many white middle income residents of the parish, Deborah was intimately familiar with the social challenges plaguing North Baton Rouge. As an active member of a community organization there called Together Baton Rouge, she had opposed the St. George effort and she volunteered time to campaign against it. She was realistic about the severity of racial inequality in Baton Rouge, but she spoke with pride about how much Together Baton Rouge has brought Black and white residents together. The race crap is gone, she said, in reference to their gatherings. That is not an issue. As opposed to other settings around town where the topic of race might be avoided, at Together Baton Rouge, she said, we're comfortable. We've used those words enough with each other. We can talk about it. On the surface, Randy and Deborah look like polar opposites. Randy is proudly conservative, a bold supporter of St. George, and adamant that race is of little significance in Baton Rouge. Deborah falls at the other end of the spectrum in both her politics and her stance on St. George, and she believes racial inequality is a major issue in the area. Yet, the conclusions Randy and Deborah reach have something in common. Whether race doesn't play into it or the race crap is gone, both reveal an understanding of race relations in which their own racial group interests are largely irrelevant to shaping their perspectives, priorities, or motivations. Even as Deborah believes that race is a powerful structural force shaping life outcomes in Baton Rouge, she argues that racial categories can be superseded when they're sharing stories and perspectives. So this chapter explores such instances when similar logic underlies the speech of white residents of Baton Rouge, despite the range of political opinions they express, ultimately revealing a shared perspective descending from white Americans' place atop the racial hierarchy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for that. I just want to dive in a bit deeper on like what was on display during that passage or like overarching components. Of course, you do have like your findings, but looking a bit more about like what you saw or like common themes throughout your interviews with participants in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The question is, like, what's the point of introducing Randy and Deborah? And thank you all for bearing with me. I know it's not that often someone reads to you on Zoom, but I do think it helps to introduce the people that I was really working with. So, I planned to go to Baton Rouge initially to interview people who supported St. George, and we can chat a little bit more about the idea of threat. But part of the area of research I work in deals with these ideas of feelings of threat. And so I was interested, how do these people who are acting as if threatened by their Black neighbors, right, wanting to get away from sharing a city with Black people, sharing school districts with Black people. So I was looking for people like Randy. And I ended up talking to a lot of people like Deborah as I just worked to get the history of the effort, to understand the context. I talked to people who were less anti-St. George, but just observers. And I also talked to several Black residents of the area. But I had initially thought of that as just, setting the scene and understanding things. But then what happened is that I started to find surprising similarities in how people on opposite sides of the St. George debate, primarily talking to white people, similarities in how these folks seem to understand local racial politics, despite really disagreeing with each other. And that's what the Randy and Deborah exchange tries to show, that what people are saying is different, but what they are doing is similar, and that they are revealing similar underlying logic. And I argue across a handful of strategies that identify in that chapter that they're collectively defending the color line, even as they have these really different and disagreeing opinions. And so I argue that, this defense of the color line is rooted in a shared white perspective. I mentioned that earlier, and I define that as, a shared vantage point, a viewpoint on racial politics influenced by white racial identity and the structural place that white Americans occupy in the US racial hierarchy. And the thinking here draws on the concept of positionality, or structural position affects what you see. Literally, where you stand will affect what you see, which most notably informs something called standpoint theory, which some of you might work with and encounter a lot, which really highlights the insight that people who are subjugated in a given system can offer into the workings of power. So, if you want to understand the harms of capitalism, go talk to a worker, not to a boss. If you want to understand misogyny, talk to someone who identifies as a woman, right? This is all about theorizing from below and what you can understand about power when you're the person who's oppressed by it. In my book, I flip the script and I actually am asking, okay, well, what are the powerful missing from their perspective then? What are the assumptions, the ways that race might color their perspective that they're not aware of? One big problem in political science scholarship on race is the assumption that whiteness equals neutrality or objectivity. And so I am really interested in pushing against that and, asking, okay, how is whiteness also contributing to a particular subjective view of the world? And so that's the core finding that comes out of stories like Randy and Deborah's. And I look at different ones throughout the chapter and apply them throughout the book, whether the ways that white people will similarly defend their own position, kind of defer to the social order or legitimize white concerns and minimize Black ones. And then on the flip side, how they will similarly otherize Black folks, who will, defend the color line as we think about how they view an outgroup. So it's both about defending your in-group and also how you see an outgroup as different or fundamentally other from yours. And so Baton Rouge and stories like this one end up forming the basis of this argument about a white perspective that then I go on to apply throughout the book.
No, thank you for that. And I think something that I thought was really interesting, just even the setup of the book, was like these conversations that you were having about race. And you do discuss that there was a bit of pushback or critique about the idea of a Black woman having conversations about race with white Southerners. I think it's funny because I found myself like some of the critiques, I was like, ooh, I probably would have thought the same thing, or like they wouldn't be honest about the conversation or wouldn't be comfortable having the conversation. But for you, could you tell me about the dynamics of that experience, but your response to the pushback and your commitment to still seeking out this perspective in spite of it?
Yes, absolutely. And so this element of my research, the fact that, I am a Black person who was interviewing a lot of white people about racial issues, definitely drew some commentary and attention and at times skepticism, particularly when I was developing my research design and in conversation with mainly white professors. And I think it's worth recognizing that while it is rare in, political science scholarship, it is by no means a new idea for Black Americans to be watching white Americans with an ethnographic gaze, right? Like as far back as slavery, it was absolutely essential for Black people to ethnographically observe white people to understand how they worked, what made them upset, how to, protect ourselves and survive. And there, that tradition continues today. So it's not an unheard of concept, but yes, it is definitely rare in US racial politics scholarship research. And that is what some of the source of the skepticism, was and what I had to respond to. And so in terms of how I responded, I think first was the question of how to address the doubts that folks raise. Like you mentioned, will people talk to you? What will they say? And then there are a few benefits that I ended up arguing my racial identity, my positionality had that maybe wouldn't be evident or that we don't really think of when we kind of by default jump to kind of some skepticism about this arrangement. So first on the doubts and addressing those, I think first it's, this idea people aren't going to talk to you. And that I had to clarify my approach and also some of the details of the context. So I was asking people about the case of St. George. Again, the fact that these very racialized shootings happened meant that, you know, we would be talking about that inevitably because people would bring it up. I wasn't asking anyone, you know, tell me your deep, dark secrets or tell me what you think about Black people or anything like that. So I think it's important to recognize that's part of the value of asking people what they think about an issue, exploring racialized issues, as opposed to directly asking them as if I were doing a public opinion survey. I also felt it was important to clarify, particularly given that the few professors who were skeptical about this were not from the South. It felt important to also clarify that a huge legacy of the Jim Crow South is white Southerners' ability to maintain emotional distance, social distance from Black people, despite physical proximity. And so as someone familiar with the South, I was much less concerned that people would just be worried about talking to me as a Black person, because you just can't avoid Black people if you're a white person in Baton Rouge. And so that's not to say they don't have other strategies, again, to like maintain that distance, but I was less worried that people would just reject talking to me on the whole. Then the other big doubt that was expressed is, okay, well, people will talk to you, but they're just going to say what you want to hear. This is social desirability bias, or this idea that, you know, oh, I'm just going to make you think I'm a good non-racist person. And that's a really important issue to engage with. And I talk about it and think about it a lot in the book. But I think the challenge is that there is this underlying assumption that I kind of hinted at in our discussion around the last question, which is the assumption that, you know, it is a neutral or objective conversation if a white interviewer is talking to a white person about race, as if that is not also a performative space, and as if racial identity doesn't also influence the way the interviewer will ask questions and the way the interviewee will respond. And so that, I think, leads to one of the benefits that I argue my positionality had, which was that I subtly racialized the interview setting, right? I brought race into the room. I do think people were more likely to comment on some of these things because they recognized they were talking to a Black person, whether that they were going to, you know, try harder to defend St. George as non-racist or talk about the shootings, or these comments that I would get all the time about, you know, people like me, or, you know, about the Black middle class and our responsibilities to the community and all of these things. And so I would argue that that was helpful, again, theoretically helpful in illuminating more the opinions and perspectives. And then the final benefit that I talk about in the book is this idea of being an outsider within. And so the outsider within is a term that Patricia Hill Collins uses to refer to the position of Black women in the academy in general. And so that was, you know, true for me, but I think also particularly in Baton Rouge, I had some insider status in that, you know, all of my family is from South Louisiana. I, you know, have a connection to the South. I could connect with people. I also had some kind of legitimacy as an interviewer coming from, you know, a recognized university, et cetera. But then I also had these outsider identities in being a stranger, which can actually sometimes be easier to talk to and to tell things to than someone who's in your own community. And I also have these non-dominant identities, like being a young person and being a woman, that probably made me seem less threatening than I might have otherwise. And so this mix of insider and outsider positionality, or a blend of familiarity and distance, can also be a tool, right? It can also be useful. And that's not to say that someone with different identities could never have done this project, but it would have been different. And I think my big push overall is not that we shouldn't raise these questions and engage with them, but that we shouldn't only raise them when Black people are doing the work, right? We should also be raising them. Someone should also be asking, like, how does my identity as a man, or as a white person, or as a straight person, or whatever other identity? They should also be reflecting on how that might be shaping their research, their approach to interviews or relationship to their interviewees, as much as it was important for me to reflect on my identities.
Yeah, and I think like the point that you're making refer back to this like undertone of the white perspective being connected to neutrality, and the idea that this is a standpoint, and in any other deviation is one where it's now you have to account for that perspective or the impact of that perspective, because we're now deviating from neutral to a more like biased perspective, for example.
Yeah.
But exactly. In chapter 5, you talked a bit about the threat of the Black middle class, and I want us to dive into this a little bit. So I've had a couple, we're constantly having these conversations, particularly among Black Rhodes scholars and residents here, where by virtue of the scholarship and the opportunities offered to it, by virtue of an Oxford education, you may now be in a place or a position where you will experience a very different economic situation than your parents. And this ascension through like privilege and positionality economically. And I kind of wanted to discuss what you discussed a bit more, Sal, like you define it as like the in-betweenness for Black middle class, where it's as though you have to choose between either your racial identity, as it essentially conflates with your economic position by being someone who's part of the middle class, but also how do you navigate the tension between those two positions? Because in some ways you defy that historical stereotype of Blackness and poverty.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'll first just briefly explain that this idea of the threat of the Black middle class, and then maybe reflect on what it means experientially, or what it meant for me, or might mean for some of you who identify as part of that group. So in terms of the threat of the Black middle class, one of the most typical ways of talking about the relationship between prejudice and place is this hypothesis called the racial threat hypothesis. And so I've kind of hinted at this so far, but it's this very old finding that in settings where a Black majority is more sizable, so too is there a more sizable threat that is posed to a nearby white majority. So as a Black minority grows, so does the threat they pose in terms of competition for resources, jobs, or many other things, but also just in terms of amplifying racially hostile actions or attitudes among the white majority. So that's the racial threat hypothesis. It comes out of the 1940s South. It's actually where I started in my master's research. But then the question that I kept coming back to, including through this Baton Rouge, field work, was, what is the consequence of locating threat in the Black population, saying that this Black population is a threat to a nearby white population, and subtly positioning white people as victims of a racial threat, right? Like that is, in some ways, it's just kind of the rhetorical structure of how this research has been done. But I started to kind of question, well, like, why are we saying that whites are receiving this threat or victims, as opposed to recognizing their power and agency as viewers who are seeing the Black population as threatening? And so this is really inspired by my development of this argument about a shared white perspective. And so I'm interested in kind of challenging ideas about threat and putting the onus on the white viewer and asking, well, from this one, not objective, but subjective, like any perspective is subjective, from this subjective viewpoint, how might you construe things as threatening? And then, so in chapter 5, I explore this further, and I look at opinion among white Americans during the 2007 through 2009 recession. And essentially I show that in places where unemployment was rising the most is where white people were most likely to think that Black people were getting richer and that white people were getting poorer. So to perceive this narrowing gap, this idea that Black people are catching up, economic insecurity being the number one predictor of that, shrinking gap. And then I find that the perception of this closing gap, or Black people catching up, goes on to make white people more likely to oppose affirmative action. And I talk about this as, a way to think about what threat the Black middle class might pose if we think about the threat of them catching up, as opposed to the typical ways we talk about Black people as threatening, which often are in relationship to things associated with lower income status, associated with poverty. So we talked about, threatening Black people. We're often not talking about people who would be seen to be, getting richer and catching up with white people, or just generally speaking, Black middle and upper class. So that's the threat of the Black middle class. And I think I do find it interesting as someone who occupied, has experienced that in-betweenness of feeling, you feel your class identity, but you also feel your racial identity, and feeling that even if you, do make it to a place where you occupy the same space as people who, share certain, like even just the ways we're socialized by class, right? Even if you aren't sharing necessarily the same economic position, but you're performing the same class identity at a place like Oxford, right? You're participating in these ridiculous dinners and going to balls and dressing in certain ways, and you're occupying that space, but you recognize the ways in which either because of what we know about wealth disparities versus income disparities, or things like that, or just because of your racial identity, you're not fully part of that world, or you feel the pull of a different identity. And I think that it very much was my experience, at least, at being in a place like Oxford, contributed to my thinking about that. What does it mean to be a Black person in this area? And even just the ways, the number of stories I have about the ways that I would feel like people would react to my presence or would respond when I told them my research, or I just was kind of observant of how I felt like I was being treated, maybe differently than some of my white peers, definitely differently than some of my male peers. And I have like a million stories of these that maybe some of you have as well. And you always raise these questions, but it's kind of, for me, was occupying that between space, having those questions that just made me interested in, well, are there ways we can, quantitatively, in a research setting, also kind of probe, the suspicion, this idea that people are reacting to us differently, even if we do seem to share a class identity or particular ways of moving through the world in consumption, or in terms of our work, or in terms of our scholarships, or what have you, that this racial divide does persist. So those are some thoughts. I think it's such a meaty topic of conversation, and I would love to hear other people's experience of that sort of thing. But that just kind of tries to highlight at least one way my research intersects with that question.
And I think that it also really validates that experience as well, that in-betweenness. Not only is it felt by that experience is also seen and it's appreciated as well, which I think is really important. But I want to talk a bit about your experience, continuing on that, the notion of being at Oxford and all these really interesting experiences are oftentimes very different from being at home. I think what I loved was just the opportunity for you to bring a piece of home literally with you to Oxford, given that this book is based off of your DPhil that you completed while you were here. So you could maybe just talk a bit about your decision to pursue a topic that is really connected to you on a personal level, particularly in a place like Oxford, where you not conceive or engage with these types of relations in the same way, and then how that either shaped your experiences or how it shaped the argument for the book.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it is kind of funny in retrospect how my topic just became more and more autobiographical as I continued to work on it and got further into the process. So in terms of deciding to pursue this topic in the first place and how Oxford fit in, I definitely was influenced by my own experience of different geographies. Not a crazy mobility story, but growing up in the South, going to undergrad in the Northeast of the US, and then coming to Oxford, as someone who is in some settings racially ambiguous, just recognizing how differently people reacted to me and how different conversations about race were, I think was part of what made me a little bit interested in this question of geography. I think I'm also just interested in kind of community and how differences intersect. And so I kind of fell into this interest of, consequences of living in diverse settings for politics in general. But then the work became more and more focused on the Black American experience, because during my time at Oxford, things were, only becoming more and more heated as the Black Lives Matter movement really kind of took off, as we drew more attention to the murders of Black men and women and children by police, as Trump is elected, as all of these things happen. And I end up really focusing from broadly kind of difference in ethnicity and identity and geography to this question related to Blackness and geography in the US. So I kind of get to that point. And then, I did feel really strongly about doing research in the US, given that I was studying this topic from the UK, and I really wanted to have a connection, and I kind of wanted an excuse to spend more time in this place that's such an important family home for me. And so that leads me to this field work. But what happens around the time that I'm, having these conversations with Randy and Deborah and their counterparts is that I, in my DPhil, finally kind of internalized the really obvious point that research comes from people. And that seems so, it's obviously the truth, but it was when I was, getting further into my DPhil and starting to meet people who had written these landmark papers about anti-Black prejudice in the US. And I realized that so many of them were older white men. I mean, so grateful for their contributions to this field. And also meeting them in person was a really confronting experience and making me think about, okay, well, how does their whiteness influence the work they're doing? And so it's like kind of this time where I'm doing this field work, I have this revelation that really spurs me to think more about, the basis of knowledge and what we assume to be true and neutral or objective. And Oxford certainly played a role in that in terms of being, predominantly white institution, in terms of constantly making me think about my own racial identity and how it was perceived. But it also, I think, had the really wonderful benefit of, despite being far away from the US and, not being a place where it's kind of people were working on similar topics, a place that just allows an amazing amount of cross-pollination between fields. So I was talking to some friends over the weekend who are doing PhDs here in the US, and they're just blown away when I reference the kinds of conversations that were just commonplace at Oxford, and the number of reading groups that I did and seminars I helped run that weren't just, in a department, but were with people from all over the university. And, so many of these were with the Rhodes Scholar community. We're at Rhodes House, somewhere at the Rothermere American Institute next door. And it just meant that I think I had the opportunity to read, to engage with art and with just, political critique and with, Black thought broadly construed far outside of political science. And to feel like I had the space, because there weren't a ton of people who were being territorial about what their idea was in our department or anything like that. I had the space to kind of creatively find what felt like an interesting and true argument to make to me. And so, by the end, like, I'm doing this project that's not just about being a Black person, it's like deeply connected to the South. It talks about the Black middle class, it's so many things that intersect with my identity. But I think that was reflecting experiences I was having, lessons I was learning. And again, I think as much as I reflect on what parts of my identity have made me interested in this topic and should explain my interactions with it, I think that's something that is important to bring to anything, right? I think all of us can ask, well, from what position do I approach this topic? How does this reflect my own life? What's motivated me about that? And so my story ends up being hugely shaped by my journey to and through Oxford. And while there were challenges to that, like being far away and not always having a community working on similar things, there were also huge benefits in terms of, like I said, that spirit of collaboration and cross-disciplinary pollination, and just the kind of support to kind of go out on the limb and build an argument that I wanted to.
And kind of on that note of like the DPhil experience and process, can you describe a bit more, like either the decision to convert it from the Oxford DPhil to the book manuscript, or the process, and what that was like, given like, I guess like this is like an incredible body of work, but taking that additional step of putting it in a different format, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone on the call happens to be interested in this process, I'd be more than happy to chat more specifically about, the nuts and bolts of it. I think probably a lot of us can identify with the impulse to hope that this thing you've worked a ton on is read by more than just the two people who are assigned to be your examiners. And I would encourage folks who have that impulse to bring their work to a broader audience, that you follow it, because I do think it's so important in general. I think I felt particularly motivated at the end of my DPhil because I did end up making a comment about the assumptions that are really prevalent in this specific area I work on, and the ways in which the language scholars use, the assumptions they make, the way they construct their arguments show this tendency to dehumanize Black people, to not engage with them, to assume that a white view is the only view or a neutral view. And that ended up feeling really important for me to engage with, because I just felt like as a grad student, I didn't find a book on my topic that seemed to have a viewpoint like this work. And so even if I could just reach, a couple of grad students out there interested in similar things and kind of wanting to challenge some of those default tendencies, it felt worth doing. It probably would have been easier to publish as a few papers, just because I do look at a lot of different policy areas and a lot of different time periods. Like there's a lot of threads in the book, but I personally felt strongly about weaving the full narrative together and about what a book allows you to do in terms of kind of creating an experience for a reader. Like I said, I'd be very happy to chat with anybody, further another time or offline if it could be useful, because I know I tried to find everyone I could to get advice on the process. But the like kind of high level things I found were, whereas a DPhil is both a time when path dependency is kind of important, like you really shouldn't unnecessarily rewrite things, and you really should try to, salvage your work and like build on things, and don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. And like I mentioned, there are these people whose job it is to read your work. You have a captive audience, and you are, defending your dissertation, in that you're like showing, oh yes, I deserve this degree. A book is opposite in so many ways. To the path dependency point, you have to be willing to, rip things up and start again, let go of work that you've done, or totally rethink things. And you also have to tell people why they should read your book, not just from a, this is novel for the literature, but you have to tell an editor, right? Like, why will this sell? Like, why will people buy this? And it's a really different challenge. And so it was really a big mindset shift. And, to implement those two things, for example, I totally reordered the book. I used to end with this Case George study, and I end up moving it to the front and kind of using the power of narrative to give people like a better way to understand things. But it meant I totally reworked the theoretical frame. And so, I had to let go of a lot. I had to really think about what would make it interesting to editors, easier to describe in a marketing form. But I do think it ended up being a really fulfilling process. And it's definitely a testament to how like getting feedback and revision can take projects to a new place. And it's true, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. But you can also make things a lot better when you have the time and space to take them apart and put them back together.
No, that's really informative. I think it's just like knowing that there's are multiple avenues and venues to like convey your work, and like the importance of investigating both of them.
Mm-hmm.
But at this time, I will take any questions. The Q&A is open from the audience. If anyone wants to submit any questions throughout this time, or wants to send me or Georgie a question. Georgie, I believe there was a question that was submitted initially. Maybe we could answer that one now.
Yeah, we did. We had one asking Nina, what's been the most surprising response to your work?
Oh, yes. I think two things have surprised me, whether they should have been surprising or not. Maybe I could have anticipated them. I think one is how by far the thing that I have gotten the most interest on just from chatting with people about it is the fact of me being a Black person talking to white people. And when doing the research, like I obviously engaged with it, I recognized I needed to explain it, but I didn't anticipate the extent to which that would really rise to the top for a lot of people. And I'm sure that reflects the fact that a lot of my readers have been white themselves and are just interested. I think that has been the thing that has most made people reflect on their positionality and thinking about the times they interact with Black colleagues, with Black friends, with Black people in their space. So that I wasn't anticipating that to be the thing that came out over and over again as people kind of engage with the work. But I think hopefully it's been a productive thing, again, to that point, like how can we all think about our identities as one specific position? And then I guess the other surprising thing to me has been some of the responses I've gotten from people really far outside the US context. I think I wasn't really sure how much it would resonate. It obviously is a really specific story in a particular place. And I think was just not expecting, and this is another testament to the Rhodes community, the Oxford community, the people who might engage with your work, but have had some interesting conversations with people in the Netherlands and in New Zealand and places really far away who have been thinking about, well, how might this apply to my location? And that was surprising, given that it is a pretty technical, specific academic book. And so it was, surprising and exciting that people were still engaging with it and thinking of all of these extensions in their local areas.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes. The floor is still open for any more questions. Nina, is there anything specific that you would like to share with us, or like one parting message you want us to walk away from the club today? But
no message or parting words from me other than what we've said. But happy to hear any other questions. If anyone has a specific question, again, about your experience thinking about turning your research into a book, happy to chat about that. Happy to chat about anything else. But also we can give you 4 minutes back if everyone's ready for their day to continue.
It's Charlie Graydon, and I'm in France, and I was very intrigued with your work and your comments. I'm very impressed with the work that you've done and looking forward to reading your book. I wanted to just say that I did the same, and I sent a message to you personally, Nina. I did the same as you. I took my PhD thesis and turned it into a book. And I hope that your book is successful, and I'm sure, as I said, I will get a copy, and I hope that all of the other people who are attending today will also have a copy if they don't already have one and have already read it. So I will have to read it now. So it sounds excellent. I'm very impressed with your work and the research that you did. So I'll just make that comment.
Thank you, Charlie. And I'm excited to check out your book too. Thank you for sharing the title. I should put it in the chat so others can look into it as well.
I'll like hold it up, but here it is.
And I also just wanted to echo what Charlie has said. I'm Laura Lee. I'm tuning in from my cardiology clinic in Boston, and I'm just so inspired to see how your beautiful work is blossoming, starting from thesis and on. So really look forward to reading your book and learning more. So thank you so much for this wonderful conversation today.
Great. Thank you, Laurel. Thank you so much for taking time out of what I'm sure is a busy,
No.
day. So it's so good to have you here.
No, thank you.
And then I also just dropped the name of Charlie's book in the chat, so we can all check that out as well.
Thank you very much, Nina. That one's the one that's harder to read. The one that's easy to read is a children's book, which is called Life on Planet Earth, My Story. And that one has pictures, so much easier, much more fun to read. They're both about environmental and climate change matters. But anyway, your book is the one that we need to focus on today. And I'm very impressed with what you have done in your book. It's excellent. And I don't know that I want to meet either Randy or who was the other lady? Who was the lady?
Deborah.
Deborah or Randy.
Yes.
They sound interesting people, though. They both have their ideas.
That is definitely true.
All right, well then, if there's no other questions, we can give you all a couple of minutes back. And thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Nicole and Nina, so much for the time today and the time it takes preparing for this as well. We all really appreciate you being here. So thank you so much. Have wonderful mornings, afternoons, evenings, wherever you're calling from. And hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you, Nicole.